Golden Valley, Arizona, a place so quiet you can hear the dust settle. But on the morning of September 24th, 2023, something was very wrong. She fed them, named them, loved them like family. So why did they tear her apart? She was known around town as the woman who rescued the unwanted, the forgotten, a gentle soul who opened her home to nearly 24 dogs. But when deputies arrived that day, the barking had stopped, and what they found behind that broken gate would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 70-year-old Jenna Sidle, once a hero to abandoned animals, now lay lifeless in her own backyard. Mauled, mutilated, partially consumed. But how does a woman devoted to saving dogs end up eaten alive by her own rescues? You won't believe the red flags that came before, or how long they were ignored. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome. We tell real, gripping stories of animal attacks that shook communities and left investigators stunned. Hit that like button, subscribe for more intense true-life documentaries, and share this video if it moved you. Because today's story is one you'll never forget. Now, let's start. They called her the Dog Lady of Golden Valley. To most who knew her, Jenna Sidle was quiet, humble, and unfailingly kind. She didn't ask for attention, and she certainly didn't expect thanks. But for over a decade, she had quietly turned her rural property, just off North Lomita Street in Mojave County, Arizona, into a haven for the unwanted. She was 70 years old, a retired volunteer who spent nearly every waking moment surrounded by animals most people had long given up on. Strays from the desert, abandoned litters from nearby towns, dogs with scars, trembles, and trust issues. Where others saw danger, Jenna saw hope. Local residents often caught glimpses of her on morning walks, a soft-spoken woman in a sun-faded t-shirt and sandals, flanked by a trail of mutts of every size and shape. She was always feeding strays, one neighbor recalled. I never saw her without a dog nearby. Some people thought she was odd, but we all respected her. She cared more than most people ever would. In the summers, she'd leave bowls of water under the trees for the wild coyotes. In the winters, she built crude wooden shelters for the ones she couldn't bring inside. It was more than rescue. It was a mission, a quiet rebellion against the cruelty she saw in the world. But underneath that mission, cracks had already begun to show. The property had no formal fencing, just wire mesh patched together over the years. By 2023, Jenna Sidle was caring for more than 17 dogs, many of them German Shepherd mixes with histories of neglect, trauma, and survival aggression. She never turned any of them away. Some were too wild to be adopted. Others had already bitten previous owners. She believed that love could fix them, that trust could tame them, that if she just gave them enough time, they would learn to love her back. But love, no matter how deep, can only go so far. And sometimes, the very thing we try to save is what ends up turning on us. Unbeknownst to many, whispers had already begun spreading in the neighborhood. Strange barking at night, fights among the dogs, scratches on Jenna's arms that she waved off with a smile. Just a little tussle, she'd say. They're still learning. Still, she never stopped, never slowed down. She had no staff, no volunteers, and no backup plan. It was just Jenna and the pack she believed she'd saved. But behind those eyes, behind that peaceful exterior, was a growing storm, a dangerous imbalance of power. Because the truth was, Jenna was no longer in control of her own rescue, and soon it would devour her. By late summer 2023, Jenna Sidle's peaceful mission had become something else entirely. Her once loving sanctuary, nestled just beyond the dusty outskirts of Golden Valley, had turned into a fortress of barking, pacing, and rising tension. 17 dogs roamed her property, mostly large breed shepherd mixes, each with its own story of survival. Some had come from the harsh streets of Kingman, others dumped on the side of remote highways under the blistering Arizona sun. Scarred, skittish, reactive. They were animals shaped by hardship, and though Jenna had meant to save them, she may never have realized just how broken they truly were. None of them had formal obedience training. There were no kennels, no designated enclosures, just wide-open desert land, makeshift shade from warped plywood, and bowls of water that often tipped over under the chaos of pack scuffles. Jenna believed giving them freedom was the kindest choice. But to anyone looking in from the outside, it was clear. This wasn't a rescue, it was a risk. Over the years, complaints began piling up at the Mojave County Sheriff's Office. Reports of aggressive dogs seen lunging at passing vehicles, mail carriers who refused to approach the property, neighbors frightened to walk past after sundown. Some even claimed they saw fights break out among the pack, vicious and loud, only for silence to return the next morning like nothing had happened. But every time deputies arrived, Jenna insisted she was fine, that the dogs just needed time to heal, that she had it under control. The reports were written, the warnings were made, but nothing ever changed. Behind those chain-link fences, something was shifting. The dynamics of the pack, the hierarchy, the instincts. And Jenna, gentle, elderly Jenna, was no longer seen as a leader, but as a vulnerable figure in the middle of an increasingly volatile situation. More than once, she was seen with scratches down her arms, torn sleeves, bruises across her legs. She always smiled through it. "They get excited," she'd explain softly. "They mean well. They're still learning." But what Jenna may not have realized is that dogs, especially in packs, learn fast. And when discipline is absent, when food is limited, and when survival becomes routine, nature takes over. These weren't just pets anymore. They were a unit, a pack. And in every pack, there comes a moment when the weak are no longer protected. Jenna loved them. She believed they loved her back. But behind closed gates and boarded windows, her noble mission was already spiraling out of control. And soon, it would turn deadly. The signs were there, not just subtle ones, but flashing, screaming red flags that only hindsight could illuminate clearly. Over the years, the Mojave County Sheriff's Department had received multiple calls regarding Jenna Sidle's property on North Lomita Street. Reports ranged from loose dogs terrorizing the road to complaints of loud fights echoing from her backyard at night. Some of the dogs had already displayed aggressive behavior toward neighbors, lunging at fences, chasing livestock, even biting a delivery driver who had tried to leave a package by her gate. In one call from early 2022, a deputy noted that the dogs were becoming unmanageable and that Jenna appeared overwhelmed but dismissive. When they advised her to consider rehoming some of the animals or seeking help from local shelters, her answer never changed. "No," she'd whisper. "They've already been abandoned once. I won't be the second person to give up on them." To Jenna, giving up a dog, even one that had bared its teeth at her, meant betrayal. She believed loyalty had to go both ways, that with time, love could fix anything. But love alone wasn't enough to hold back a pack of traumatized, territorial dogs. Even as the warnings mounted, Jenna's resolve only grew stronger. She built higher gates, patched fences, kept more food stocked, but the problems didn't stop. One neighbor who asked to remain anonymous later told investigators, "We used to hear her yelling, not angry, just desperate. You could tell she was losing control." At one point, a former friend offered to take two of the more aggressive dogs off her hands. Jenna refused. "They stay together," she insisted. "Separating them would only make them worse." By the summer of 2023, the property had become a boiling pot of fear and frustration. Dogs constantly fighting for dominance, barking into the night, and Jenna caught somewhere in the middle, clinging to a dream that had long since turned into a nightmare. But nobody pushed harder. Nobody intervened. And in a remote desert town where help is far and pride runs deep, Jenna was left alone, with 17 dogs, with rising tension, with hope that love would win out. It didn't. And within weeks of that final warning, her silence would echo louder than any bark ever had. It was a Sunday, September 24th, 2023, and the desert air in Golden Valley was already warming under the rising sun. At 7:30 a.m., Jenna Sidle stepped out of her back door, a familiar plastic bucket in her hand, filled with dry kibble and scraps from the night before. Feeding time. The dogs were already restless, 17 of them, clawing at the wire fencing, growling, circling, pacing. Some barked in anticipation. Others fought to get closer. She had done this every morning for years, but this morning, something was different. By 8:15, the property had fallen eerily silent. No barking, no shouting, no movement. By 11:03 a.m., a neighbor finally made the call. The dogs are loose again, and I haven't seen Jenna. Her truck's still there, and the front gate's wide open. Something's not right. Deputies from the Mojave County Sheriff's Office responded quickly, arriving at the 5300 block of North Lomita Street. As their vehicles crunched onto the gravel driveway, the first thing they noticed wasn't the silence, it was the movement. Dozens of eyes peering at them from behind makeshift barricades. Dogs, large, tense, aggressive, hovered near the house, lips curled, shoulders stiff, some covered in what looked like dust, and something darker. The front porch was empty. The back gate was bent. A trail of paw prints, some smeared in red, led around the side of the property. Guns drawn, they moved cautiously. The dogs snarled but didn't scatter, as if they weren't afraid of humans anymore. And then, they saw her. Face down in the dirt, half covered in claw marks and torn fabric, Jenna Sidle's lifeless body lay just feet from her overturned feed bucket. Her hands were bloodied, one shoe missing. Her left leg had been shredded below the knee, and her shirt hung in ribbons from her back. The injuries weren't from a single bite, but many. Some of the dogs were still circling her. Others stood motionless, tails down, heads low, watching. Deputies radioed for backup, but no one could unsee what was already burned into their minds. A veteran officer would later whisper to a colleague, "In all my years, I've never seen something like that. Not like this." Animal control units arrived minutes later. They had to use tranquilizers and tasers to control several of the dogs. A few were so aggressive, so frenzied, they were put down on the spot. And in the middle of it all, what had once been a sanctuary, lay the woman who had refused to give up on them. She had gone out that morning to feed her rescues, and never came back. What they found next would turn the stomachs of even the most seasoned officers. She hadn't stood a chance. When deputies stepped closer, their boots sinking slightly into the soft, sand-covered soil behind Jenna Sidle's home, they could finally see the full horror of what had happened. Her body, what remained of it, was twisted near a half-buried cinder block. Her clothing was torn, barely recognizable, ripped open by teeth and claws. Her skin was marked with deep lacerations, some jagged, some almost surgical. But it wasn't just the brutality of the injuries that haunted them. It was the unmistakable evidence that she had tried to crawl away. Just beyond where she lay, smeared drag marks curved through the dust. Tiny furrows etched into the earth where her hands had clawed for grip. Her fingernails cracked, blood pooling in streaks behind her. She had made it no more than a few feet. They could see it clearly in the blood patterns. Jenna had been conscious during the attack, conscious enough to try to escape, conscious enough to realize the dogs she had once fed, named, and protected were now tearing her apart. 15 dogs still roamed the yard when emergency units arrived. Not one of them barked. Some growled as officers approached the body. Others stared blankly, unmoving, as if their frenzy had passed and now there was nothing left inside them. A few of the dogs bore fresh wounds of their own, from fighting each other, or perhaps from Jenna's last desperate attempts to fight back. Bite marks laced their muzzles, their fur matted with blood, not all of it hers. Animal control had no time for compassion. The scene was unstable. Multiple dogs charged at responders, teeth bared, eyes locked in on the threat. The decision was made on the spot. Several of the animals were euthanized right then and there, put down to prevent further attacks. The rest were corralled, sedated, and removed in crates. Even then, the aggression didn't stop. Snapping jaws echoed from the trucks as the last of the pack was hauled away. Jenna's lifeless body was covered with a tarp, but the image lingered, and the reality was now undeniable. She hadn't died quickly. She hadn't died peacefully. She had been mauled, mutilated, and partially consumed by the very dogs she had dedicated her life to saving. The official statement released later that day by the Mojave County Sheriff's Office was cold and clinical. She was believed to have been attacked and killed by multiple dogs on her property. But behind that sterile sentence was a far more disturbing truth, one that the public would only begin to grasp in the days to come. Her dream had become her death, and the sanctuary she had built had turned into something else entirely. Something savage, something feral, something she could no longer control. By the following morning, the headlines had already begun to spread beyond Mojave County. Local papers called it a tragedy. Regional outlets called it a horror story. But those who had known Jenna Sidle, or at least passed her in the heat of summer, bucket in hand, dogs trailing behind, struggled to make sense of it all. The official word came first from the Mojave County Sheriff's Office, issued just hours after deputies cleared the scene on September 24th, 2023. She was believed to have been attacked and killed by multiple dogs on her property. The confirmation was cold, clinical, almost too clean for what had actually happened. Days later, the autopsy report brought little comfort. The findings were brutal but clear. Canine bite injuries, multiple points of trauma, defensive wounds to the hands and arms, and fatal blood loss. There was no evidence of foul play, no suggestion of any human attacker. Just a pack of dogs, and one woman alone. The public wanted answers, but what they got were more questions. Neighbors began speaking to reporters, some with guilt in their voices, others with frustration. "We tried to warn her," one woman said. "We told her it was too many, that she needed help, but Jenna wouldn't listen." Others turned their blame elsewhere, at the authorities who had responded to complaint after complaint over the years. They knew the situation. They'd been out there. Why didn't anyone step in before it got this bad? The truth was ugly. Jenna hadn't just been living with too many dogs. She had been overwhelmed, maybe even in denial, caught in the emotional quicksand of a mission that had once brought her peace, and eventually brought her death. Whispers of animal hoarding surfaced, quiet conversations about mental health, compassion fatigue, and the lack of clear state regulations for private rescues like hers. But it was all too late. The damage had been done, and still, the community grieved. The family, already reeling from the loss, was shattered. They released a brief statement thanking first responders and asking for privacy, but never addressed the dogs or the conditions she lived in. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they didn't know. Local outlets captured the public sentiment with a shocking clarity. It's the kind of tragedy you'd never expect from someone who loved animals so deeply. But love, as powerful as it is, can't fix everything. And sometimes, it blinds us to what's coming until it's already too late. So now the question lingers, echoing across the desert like a warning carried on the wind. Was this preventable? Or did Jenna Sidle, with all her goodness, all her heartbreak, and all her devotion, refuse to be saved from her own compassion? In the days that followed the tragedy on North Lomita Street, the questions no longer centered only on Jenna Sidle, but on the dogs themselves. Were they killers, or were they victims too? Animal behaviorists, rescue volunteers, and former trainers began to weigh in. The conclusion was as complicated as the woman who raised them. These weren't just bad dogs. They were traumatized, under-socialized, and reactive animals, brought together under one roof with no structure, no discipline, and no safe outlet for their instincts. Experts pointed to a harsh reality. Untrained dogs in large, unregulated packs often revert to primal behavior. Without clear leadership, the pack establishes its own hierarchy. Power struggles erupt, survival instincts awaken, and the line between domesticated pet and wild animal begins to blur. Some of the dogs had been born on the property. Others had spent years in Jenna's care, never leaving the dusty perimeter, never encountering the outside world, and never learning to trust anyone but her. Over time, they became territorial, suspicious of strangers, and dangerously reactive to one another. Jenna believed her love could soften them, that time and food and gentle hands could overwrite years of fear and trauma. But trauma doesn't fade just because we want it to. It waits, it festers, and in a pack with no rules, it spreads like wildfire. The ethical questions came quickly. Were these animals to blame? Or had they simply been left with no other language but violence? Had Jenna, in trying to be their savior, unwittingly created the conditions for her own destruction? Animal control confirmed that several dogs had to be euthanized on site. Too aggressive, too far gone to be safely removed. Others, though sedated and captured, were held under observation in local shelters. Their fate uncertain, their eyes still wide with the kind of fear that speaks of hunger, confusion, and chaos. One rescuer who had visited the site days after the incident was quoted anonymously, "They weren't monsters, they were broken survivors. They were all just waiting for someone to tell them what to do, and no one ever did." Jenna had taken them in because the world didn't want them. She gave them food, shelter, and her entire heart. But in the end, no one could be rescued. Not them, not her. And somewhere in that quiet desert yard under the cracked Arizona sky, the line between savior and victim vanished completely. Because sometimes, even love becomes dangerous when it's given without limits. And sometimes, the very lives we save are the ones that take us down. The wind moves slowly through the yard now, silent, still, no barking, no claws scraping against the fencing, no shadowed eyes watching from corners, just dust, drifting through the 5300 block of North Lameda Street. An old water bowl, tipped on its side, a cracked feeding bucket half buried in the sand, and a single bouquet of fading flowers tied gently to the rusted front gate. It is a place that once held hope. Now it holds only memory. Jenna Sidle died doing what she loved, giving broken things a second chance. But love, when given without boundaries, without help, without structure, can become something else. Something dangerous, something deadly. Her story is not just about dogs or danger. It's about what happens when compassion becomes isolation. When one woman shoulders a weight no one could carry alone, and no one steps in until it's too late. So if you or someone you know is overwhelmed by animals, by good intentions gone too far, reach out, ask for help, offer support. Because sometimes the people who seem the strongest are the ones barely holding it all together. Compassion should never cost your life. She gave them a home. They took her life. If this story impacted you, don't scroll past. Like this video to help more people hear Jenna's story. Share it with someone who needs to understand the risks of compassion without limits. And subscribe to this channel for more powerful, real-life documentaries that reveal the hidden tragedies behind animal rescue, survival, and loss. Your engagement helps us keep these stories alive and may help save lives. Thanks for watching.